Hi, my name is Sarah and this is the very first episode of my YouTube channel, Sarah Stitches UK. I'm also Sarah Stitches UK on Instagram, and this is Flosstube with a twist. So what my idea is that the first half of this video will be Flosstube, where I show you my stitching, my whips, and a couple of finishes. And then in the second half of the video, it'll be more like Booktube, where I am going to review a book which is about stitching. Today's book is the book Samplers by Rebecca Scott of Whitney Antiques. And that section of the video is going to be called Sarah's Stitching Bookshelf. So hopefully that's something that sounds interesting to you. So let's get into talking about a little bit about my stitching history. And then, as I said later, we'll get into the book review. So like many people, I got back into stitching in the last couple of years, in the summer of 2024. Before that, I had stitched as a teenager and then again in my early 20s, and I picked it up, as I said, in the summer of 2024. One of the first things that I stitched was this project, which is by Tiny Modernist, called Dream Big. It was a Patreon piece, but is now widely available. This is stitched on 16 count cream Aida using the called for DMC threads. And I thought that this was a particularly appropriate finish to show you to start with, given the idea of the channel to combine stitching and reading. And I just loved this chart. The moment I saw it and I was like, yes, I've got to hop onto the Patreon. I've got to get this chart as soon as possible. So I was very excited to stitch it. And also around that time, I learned that you didn't have to frame finish everything. So this was the first time I tried my hand at a pillow finish. I hadn't quite realised it would end up so large, but I think I'm kind of pleased that it did, because it means it can now sit here as a cushion on the sofa next to me. So it's just finished with a piece of plain cream fabric on the back. So that is Dream Big by Tiny Modernist. So we'll pop that back here. After stitching that, one of the things, by the time I'd stitched that, I was watching Flosstube a lot, and I'd really got into reproduction samplers. And the first major reproduction sampler that I tried my hand at was Sarah Milthorpe. She's sitting here. So this is my version of Sarah Milthorpe by Hands Across the Sea. So she is stitched on 40 count light Sanditon by Swan Bay Fabrics using DMC, mostly the called for, but I did make one or two changes. So if I show you the cover of the book, you'll see that there is a verse in the middle there, and I switched that out. And also in one or two places I changed the colours. So I changed the colours of these little trees and flowers on the bottom here. I used colours that were already in the sampler, but I just wanted to make it a little bit brighter perhaps. So that's the chart, and this is my version. And this motif here comes from a book called The Sampler Motif Book by Brenda. And I think this is such a handy book, and probably one that I will review on the channel in the future, all being well. And the particular pattern that I've used in the middle here is called Birds in a Bower. And as the book says, this is an extremely versatile and can be used in a number of different ways. And the book shows it done in all black and done in black and red. And here I use colours from the rest of the chart. So I used the green from the border as the bower, and I used the red as the berries. And then I took the motifs from the bottom here and added them in up at the top to give the bower some more framing. So this, I think, is probably safe to say is my absolute pride and joy. So this is my adaptation of Sarah Millthorpe by Hands Across the Sea. So I'll pop her back up there. Nice. One of my most recent finishes is the Quick Quaker Sal by Modern Folk Embroidery, which ran through the month of April, and I have my finish here to show you. I really enjoyed stitching along with this. I loved the daily videos. I thought it was an absolutely fabulous experience. I've not done the Christmas stitch along, but I can see why it's so popular. This is Quick Quaker by Modern Folk Embroidery, stitched on 40 count Silver Moon by Zweigart using DMC 310 and Weeks Dye Works Turkish Red for some of the accents. Now Jacob has already announced that he's going to be doing another month-long stitch along in August, the Fast Frisian. I'm already signed up for that. And I think that before that, I'm going to re-stitch this in red, in all red, I think, with a view to putting together a collection of red samplers in different styles over time. I know lots of us aspire to having a red wall, and I am no different. But for now, this one I've got a home for it in mind. I've got a frame on order. I'm going to have a go at lacing and framing it myself. I'll let you know how I get on. But this is Quick Quaker Sal by Modern Folk Embroidery. And I'm certainly enjoying my stitch alongs at the moment. I'm participating, as many people are, via the Hands Across the Sea Facebook page in the Maria Wales Newson 1838 stitch along, hosted by the wonderful Judy, who is keeping us all right on the Facebook page. And I have, again, I've tweaked some of the colours a little bit, and I chose a brighter linen because I wanted it to be brighter than it seemed to be showing. So let me show you my version of Maria Wales Newson. Wrangling the fabric. Here we go. So this is Maria Wales Newson, stitched on 40 count peridot by Fibre on a Whim, using the DMC with some adjustments, as I said. One of the main adjustments that I made is, in addition to the verse, which I personalised and I changed that, is the house. I went for a more brownish red colour in the house. The called for colour is this colour that's the outline of the flower, which I think is DMC 221, but this I'm pretty sure was DMC 355, which is more of a, to my mind anyway, more of a brick red. And I'm also in the process of turning the lights on in the house. I like to have the lights on in my house. Lots in the samplers, so many houses have the lights off. You can see it's very dark in that house, but I like to turn the lights on and imagine the fun and activities that are going on in the house. So here you can see, hopefully, I've turned the lights on in Maria's house. So that is Maria Wales Newson, 1838, by Hands Across the Sea, stitched on a blanket of 40 count peridot linen by Fibre on a Whim. And this is really the project that I'm working on for the most part. At the moment, alongside, I'm also working on the 1832 red sampler, and I'll perhaps bring that to show you next time. So that's all the stitching I've got to show you for right now. If you'll bear with me 2 seconds, we'll skip into the next part of the video, Sarah's Stitching Bookshelf, where I'm going to review Samplers by Rebecca Scott. See you in a second. Is the second part of the video, and I've decided to call this Sarah's Stitching Bookshelf. And the first book that we're going to be looking at from my bookshelf, as I said before, is Samplers by Rebecca Scott. So the reason that I chose this particular book was for the very simple reason that it was one of the very first books about stitching that I ever bought. I think I saw it on a few Flosstubes recommended there, and so I decided to go ahead and get hold of a copy. I think I'd also heard by that time, having watched Nicola Parkman's videos about Whitney Antiques and also about Rebecca Scott, so this seemed like a perfectly good place to start. And I think I was really lucky that I chose such a good book as a starting point, because it really does provide a great overview of the subject of samplers. So I think if you're looking for a place to start, then you probably couldn't go far wrong choosing this particular book. So the emphasis in the book is very much on British samplers, but it does cover, I think there's a chapter on American samplers, and also in the final chapter, sorry, no, not the final chapter, in the chapter about samplers of the poor, there is also some discussion about samplers that were produced in India under British colonial rule. So the focus is very much on British samplers, but there is some insights into American samplers and also into the other places where British samplers became influential. The book is incredibly well illustrated. It's really beautiful. Many colour pictures are provided. You can see the detail in the samplers. But this isn't a coffee table book, you know, that there is some really substantial content here which will teach you about the history and the development of samplers. The book approaches samplers in roughly chronological order so that you can see how samplers developed and changed over time, although Rebecca Scott is clear that this isn't always a linear progression, so that earlier traditions do sometimes carry over into later periods. There are chapters on the 17th and 18th centuries, as well as chapters on Quaker samplers, samplers of the poor, so looking particularly at Bristol samplers, and also 19th century samplers. And as I said, there's also the chapter on American samplers as well. The book doesn't go into the 20th century, and the introduction talks about the rationale for this, which I thought was very interesting, because Rebecca Scott explains that come the 20th century, samplers had changed, that they were no longer being produced by little girls as part of their education, but rather they had become a hobby, which of course is the hobby that we all know and love. So I think this is a really strong rationale, but it's interesting to think about how this transition takes place, and presumably, and this is me guessing, it doesn't actually say this, presumably it's to do with women going into work, it's to do with industrialisation, to do with women needing different skills for the work that they're doing, so that their work is no longer based, their employment opportunities are no longer based around needlework, but are perhaps increasingly based around factory labour, and then into the 20th century, sort of into typing and so on. So as women's education has to change, presumably, away from needlework as women's employment opportunities change. But I, for one, am really glad that we get to still enjoy this hobby today. The book takes you through the way samplers evolve from the 17th century right through to the 19th century. So it really is very thorough in sort of the coverage, so that you do get a very strong overview. The book is also good at locating samplers in their social and historical context, for example, thinking about how samplers are being produced in relation to education. One of my favourite parts of the book is the part that describes that in the 17th century you suddenly see pineapples starting to appear on samplers. And the reason that this happened was because in 1670 Charles II received a pineapple from his gardener, and so all of a sudden you have this pineapple craze that takes over, and this is reflected in samplers. And I just thought that was such a fun little anecdote, that from sort of one event in such a significant household as the Royal Palace, that you suddenly get pineapples appearing on samplers and being all the rage. This story made me think of the Hands Across the Sea sampler, which is, I think, popularly known as the Two Nellies, but is actually sort of A. Thomas 1882. And Nicola talks in her description of that sampler about how that sampler has the elephants on it, because at that time in Wales there were elephants in the circus who were travelling through Wales, and for that reason they sort of captured the imagination of this little girl, A. Thomas, and then appeared on her sampler. So I think it's very interesting to see how, although certainly we know the girls had pattern books and so on, there is also this element of freedom. And Rebecca Scott also talks about this in relation to flowers and the symbolism of flowers, because whilst we might see a sampler today and see certain flowers and know what these flowers meant in terms of sort of the symbolism of perhaps the Victorian era, it's very possible that these girls also just happened to like that particular flower and found it pretty and wanted to stitch it. So Rebecca Scott cautions us against sort of over-interpreting the samplers, and, you know, to sort of make sure that we don't try to read too much into every single element. And I think that is a really good sort of cautionary note to keep in mind. The thing that I will take away from this book, aside from my wonderful pineapple story, is this sense of evolution, of how samplers evolved from band samplers through the 17th and 18th century, through Quakers, and into the 19th century, where we start to get the samplers such as Sarah Millthorpe, with the houses and the floral borders and so on. And I really enjoyed getting this overview of sampler history from this book. In the chapter on samplers of the poor, I've mentioned that chapter talks about Bristol samplers, but it also talks about other organisations that were working with girls to produce stitched items of needlework that were then for sale. And this chapter talks about an organisation in Cheltenham in England that was selling the needlework of girls for charitable purposes, and it has a price list for the needlework. And I thought that was such an interesting detail to have included in the book, because it makes you wonder whether the people who were purchasing these objects were doing so because they found them beautiful or useful, or if they were doing it out of charity. Now, we will never know. It was probably a combination of all three, or different for everyone. But I think that seeing the price list for the different items of needlework really brings home how these objects had both social and economic value for the different people involved. And so that was one of the favourite parts of the book, where I got to see the price list for the different items of needlework. Before reading this book, I had not come across map samplers before, and I was really interested to read about them, and particularly because they're not something that we see many people stitching today. In terms of reproduction samplers, I've not really seen any map reproduction samplers being stitched, and I think that's a shame in some ways. I would really love to see that. I know the Sun City Stitchers, whose Flosstube I absolutely love watching, That's always one of the highlights of my Saturday mornings. They went on a trip to Alaska and they found they were able to purchase a map sampler of Alaska, and they're personalising it to show some of the places that they visited and the things that they saw. But generally, in terms of the reproductions, I've not really seen many map samplers. I can perhaps try and show you the picture here that really grabbed my attention, of what looks like a globe that's stitched as a 3D object just here. Now, I would absolutely love to have a go at stitching that. I have no idea how I would begin to do it in terms of the finishing, but what a cool thing to have, to be able to stitch a globe like that. So if any of you out there have a globe sampler like that you could reproduce and chart for us, that would be just fabulous. So this 3D globe sampler was from West Town School in the United States, because apparently no globe samplers are known with a British or continental origin. So it's interesting that perhaps this was something that came about in the United States more than in the United Kingdom. So I would really love to have a chance to make one of those for myself. So my shelf verdict. Will this book get a place on my bookshelf? Well, I'm pretty sure it's obvious from my review that this is absolutely a staple for me on my stitching bookshelf. I think it's a fabulous foundation that will set you on the right path in terms of your reading about samplers and sampler history. And at the back of the book, there's also a fantastic resource, an index, but also a list of places to visit if you're interested in samplers in both the United Kingdom and the United States, as well as bibliography as well. So plenty to be reading that's useful there, that would help you to sort of take the next steps in your reading. So I'm sure many of you have a copy of this book already on your bookshelves. I think it's quite a well-known, well-established book. Perhaps this video will have inspired you to go and get your copy off the shelf and have another look at it. I do hope so. If you do, I'd love to know what you think. What's your favourite image? What's your favourite story from the book? And I'd love to know what you think in the comments. And if you have any recommendations of other books that you would like to see me review as part of Sarah's Stitching Bookshelf, then you can also leave that information down there in the comments. So that's all for me now. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you on the next episode. Take care. Bye bye.